Well, I guess it's about when life as we know it ceases.
Okay.
When the breath leaves the body, the heart stops beating physically, and the person as we know them is no longer there in a way in which we can communicate with them.
Cool. That's an awesome definition. I like that. Okay. So, with that in mind, are you happy to kind of share your experiences of that? Anything that you're comfortable to share around death? It's entirely what you're comfortable and happy to talk about.
I suppose my most startling brush with death was when our son was stillborn, because that is a complicated grief, because you go into hospital expecting life and come out with death. So when grandparents have died, it's been okay, they were old, and I won't get so many Christmas presents anymore and this sort of thing. But when you are expecting life and suddenly there is death, I guess that, as I say, that's probably my most startling in your face experience of death.
Okay. So are you happy to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah.
Was that your first?
That was my third. Well, my pregnancy history is not good, but it was my third term pregnancy, and everything had been absolutely fine, perfectly normal pregnancy. I was huge, but nobody thought anything of it. And in fact, when I was first in labour, the midwife came around and I said, "Come on then, midwife's hands, how big do you reckon?" And she said, "Oh, probably 8.5 pounds." I went, "Yeah, okay, can do that." And then went into hospital and everything was perfectly normal. And then I had a huge contraction followed by a second huge contraction with very little space to recover, and the baby's heartbeat vanished off the monitor. So they got a handheld monitor and they found a heartbeat, but it was very slow. So at that point they literally threw me into theatre and did an emergency caesarean, but unfortunately Stuart didn't make it. He was stillborn, but he was over 10.5 pounds. So yes, it was totally and completely unexpected. There was nothing in the pregnancy to suggest that this was going to happen, be the outcome. There was nothing in the labour that suggested this was going to be the outcome, but it was the outcome.
So you named him Stuart?
Yeah, he was Stuart.
Was he already Stuart when you had you named him before you went into labour, or did you name him?
We didn't know that we were having a boy. Okay. We didn't, but yes, Stuart was the name we had chosen if we were having a boy. Yeah.
Okay. And if you're happy to answer, what did you do to kind of to cope with that, to remember, to to acknowledge him? What kind of things helped you to process all of that?
Well, the vicar at the time came over to Hinchinbrook and did a little service for us in the chapel, just with my parents and Martin's mum, and Stuart was with us in a Moses basket. So we did that, and then of course the hardest bit was walking out of the hospital and not having a baby to take home. And I became involved with a group called SANS, the Stillbirth and Neonatal Death Society, as it was then. I was very involved with them and ended up running it for the local branch for a while. But every year we had a memorial service in the chapel at Hinchinbrook, and they have a memorial book in the chapel at Hinchinbrook, so we had Stuart's name put in that. So yeah, we were encouraged to write everything. I was encouraged to write everything down, which I did. The midwives were brilliant and took photos for us of Stuart, and we were allowed to take our own photos. So, and we were advised, because the ones they took in the hospital were Polaroid photos, so we were advised to have some that weren't, because Polaroid photos deteriorate very quickly. So I had a memory book with photos of just Stuart, me with Stuart, and not many, just some. and then sort of through the years, each year for his anniversary, my mother did it at Hertford Church and we did it here. We had a flower arrangement and a card were in the church every year on his birthday. There is a lot more available now for people who have a late miscarriage or a stillbirth, because you can have hand and footprints done in either printed. In hospitals generally they will automatically now do a footprint and a handprint inked, but we didn't get that sort of thing. And of course we didn't have a birth certificate because he was stillborn. Whereas now there is a small certificate that you can get which just acknowledges that although the baby didn't draw breath, you still get a certificate of birth. So things have changed a lot. Latterly, looking back now over almost 30 years, I can say hand on heart that I would not be doing what I'm doing now if I hadn't have been through that experience of losing Stuart, because I was a big member of SANS and I did their befriender training, so I learnt to talk with other people about the loss of a baby, and then I went with my mum and we did a basic counselling skills course at Huntingdon College, and then life moved on. I became a teaching assistant and then I went and worked at Thongsley Fields in Huntingdon, and the level of need there was so high. I thought, oh gosh, there must be another way of being with children, and through a bit of a process I found play therapy. Well, I don't think I would have walked this route if it hadn't have been for my experiences of losing Stuart. So I would say, I now teach a postgraduate course training people to be play therapists, and I'm pretty sure that without that experience none of this would have happened. So that over the years it's got easier because I can now see something good that has grown out of that situation. But to start with, it was like, well, what's the point? What's the point of making a baby for 9 months, getting almost to the point of birth, and then meeting death? What's the point? And it took a long time for any kind of point to come out of it.
And you talk about your other 2 children that obviously lost their little brother. They've grown with you into that expectation he would come home. How are things with family? What did that look like in those sort of immediate weeks after and beyond? How did you cope as family?
Well, the younger one doesn't have any memory of it. He doesn't remember. He wasn't old enough to remember, but the older one does remember. And there were little things like after we moved here, we had the radio playing in there, and my son came running into the kitchen and said to me, Mummy, Stuart's coming. And I went, what do you mean Stuart's coming? And I came and listened to the radio, and they just introduced a speaker whose name was Stuart.
Wow. And
that was like, oh crumbs. There were still memories there that I hadn't really realised. And we did things like every Christmas we bought a special ornament for the tree, and the boys would come and help me choose the ornament, Stuart's ornament for that year for the tree, and they would know that all of the ornaments around the top of the tree were Stuart's. And we did that for a long time, probably 18 years maybe. And so that was sort of it became a family thing to do at Christmas. So for the younger one, it wasn't a massive impact on him because he now doesn't have any memory of that moment in time. But the older one does still have that memory, and still will occasionally mention his brother. So I now regret not having a grave for him, or not having had a ceremony for him, but at the time we couldn't face it. I regretted that quite quickly afterwards. We were given options. We were told, there's this or this option, but at the time we made the decision we made for where we were in that moment. But with hindsight, I would have done it differently. But
see, what I find fascinating, and I think what I think is helpful for the people to kind of to hear is that concept of ritual. And I know that's quite religious language and it doesn't connect with some people, but when you talk about the ornaments on the tree, when you talk about having somewhere to go, when you talk about having the flowers in a church, they're all rituals,
they are.
A way of marking moments, and
absolutely.
almost signposts to the next, to the year ahead, or to. And I think so. Would you say that's something that is important when
definitely.
you're processing grief and learning to live with grief?
It's one of the things about putting the flowers, and I always put a card, and to start with, it would be like an age card with the flowers in the church, and I didn't do it for this reason, but it actually helped other people to remember too. And so people would either give me a call or put a card through the door and just say, thinking of you. Whereas without that, people forget very quickly about, dates and anniversaries, because life moves on, and it moves on really fast. And you can be left thinking, well, nobody remembers him because nobody met him. So nobody remembers him. So that was just a way of, I say, I can see it now, but it wasn't the reason we did it.
No.
But it meant that Stuart's memory stayed alive for other people as well. And that was quite important, that because nobody met him, that actually there was still that memory there.
So when we talk about grief, how would you say grief was for you? What did grief look like for you?
Well, I think in the beginning, because I'd had an emergency cesarean, I was obviously wounded. But they didn't want me to stay in hospital, so Stuart was born on the Friday evening, and I was home by the Sunday morning, even though I'd had the cesarean. So there was a lot of physical pain involved to start with for me. But also I can remember denying that physical pain, and I think I came home on the Sunday, and probably the Tuesday morning I was hoovering, because I was denying that, that I couldn't. So that was sort of quite complex, because there was the physical damage as well as the emotional damage as well. But just the sadness and things that would suddenly hit you. And I think that's true, whatever a bereavement has been, there will be something that you see and that suddenly reminds you. And of course, friends who were having babies. And so even walking around town and seeing people, and I remember walking around a supermarket and everybody was just carrying on with life as normal, and I was thinking, how dare you? Do you not know what's just happened to me? How can you just be laughing and joking and buying your cornflakes? Do you not know what I've just been through? And so there was that irrational thing as well, which took a while to sort of abate. So it was tied up with the physical pain and the denial of some of that, the emotional pain that you can't get away from, and they're sort of in equal measure really. The expectation that everybody knew your story, when that was totally irrational, because why would strangers know your story? But you just have that, and just the depth of sadness, and why there was nothing wrong with him. We agreed ultimately to have a post-mortem done. There was nothing wrong with him. They did think at one point that he had something called Beckwith-Lederman syndrome, but we all had genetic screening and there wasn't enough evidence for a diagnosis of that. So as far as the medics are concerned, there was no reason that he died. And so it's like, there was just this constant why. And also why me. So,
and you've alluded to, professionally you have worked with children, with other families who have experienced death, grief, loss, whatever language. How have you seen grief in their stories? What has grief looked different in their stories to how it was for you?
Well, I guess with children, there's a lot of fear. If they like the families I've worked with where the child has actually witnessed an adult in their life dying, and there is just so much fear in that, because panic stations, 999, ambulance, blue lights, sirens, granddad being taken away, all these sorts of things, and the adults around them being so taken up with their own grief and process that the child was like, actually, I saw this too. And that's quite hard. And again, in my own experience, when you're grieving yourself as an adult, it's hard to find the space to acknowledge what's happening for your child as well. So in children, a lot of fear and anger, a lot of anger. And I think often anger is misplaced fear anyway. I think fear and anger get very muddled. A lot of raging at a higher being, whatever people might want to call that. Again, I think it's so dependent on the circumstances of the death. You know, if it's somebody who is elderly and or unwell, and it's sort of, you've known for a while that it's coming, although when it comes, there's still that, oh my goodness, it's happened, but because there has been some preparation time, you know that this is going to be the end result. It's not as shocking as it is when it's something that's unexpected.
Because there are a lot of theories around grief, and people talk about it as a process, and you work through this, and then you progress to this, and you progress to that. Have you found in your personal experience and your professional experience that is true, or would you say grief is different?
There are different stages to grief, but I don't think they go in a set order.
Okay.
And also, when you've recognised that you're perhaps here, it doesn't mean to say you don't come back to here again, because you might well do. It might be a year, 10 years, 15 years, but you may well come back to that same point. So it's like that pattern that you sometimes see of, oh, this is the line, and this is the reality, and it's all over the place. And I think it is very much like that. I don't think we can box it up.
Okay.
I mean, there are grief pathways and there are grief cycles and there's all this, but no, I don't think you can box it up.
And do you think grief ever goes away?
I think it's one of those things you learn to live with. And I am always very thankful that I have come to peace with what happened. And it doesn't I don't hold a ball of bitterness inside me. Yes, it's sad, and it still can be sad. But I have learnt to come to terms with it. Does grief ever go away? I think it lessens. I think the smarting of it recedes. But again, for some people, they will grieve for the rest of their lives. So again, I don't think that can be boxed up. But I think for me, what was most helpful was when I came to see that something good had grown out of it.
Yeah, and I think that is one thing I'm learning as I live life, is that life, death, resurrection, whether you believe the Jesus story or not, it encapsulates, it's symbolic of what is just simply true. We see it in creation, we see it all around us, and the more I talk to people who have experienced death and loss and are grieving, the more I see that actually even in the hardest, saddest, most difficult places, shoots of new life and new possibilities come. And obviously the further you get down the line away from that moment and that event, the more able you are to see what has come out of it. And it isn't easy when you're caught up to think, oh, new life always comes. But it does. And sometimes it just takes time. And I love what you said about, the way you live, like, you channeled that energy into doing good and supporting others that had gone through stillbirth, and from that you do counselling, and from that you then got into the work you do as a play therapist, and you can, to be able to name that all of that came out of this experience is really, really profound.
It is, and it has been really helpful for me to be able to let go of that, well, why, that bitterness, that really painful grief. I've been able to let go of that because there was a purpose for what happened.
Yeah, and I think the word for me there is hope. I think, you know,
Yeah, absolutely. And in the work that I do now, that's one of the ways I describe what I do, is that often families come to me, they're at the end of their tether and they don't have any hope. And so the way I describe play therapy and what I do is I hold the hope for the family until they're in a position to take that back for themselves.
Wow. Okay. So good.
But you have to recognise that before you can do it. But that's how I see the work, is that I hold that hope for them until they are able to take that hope back for themselves.